Today I'm excited to be talking to you about CTE in the school district. Just a little bit of context about this. Our office has produced a report, a yearly report about CTE in the district for a few years, and the structure of that report, generally we identify a cohort of ninth graders and then talk about where they are after what would be their on-time 12th grade year, and that forms the basis of that report. So the most recent report looked at the cohort of students that would have graduated not this most recent spring, but in the 2014-2015 school year. The next report is next on our list, but final outcomes only become available for last spring about now. So this is information about a cohort from about a year ago. So broadly speaking, these reports, there's been a fairly consistent finding that participation in CTE seems to be associated with higher graduation rates. Within the district, and this is sort of a general truth of CTE programs, the ideal model would be a student would enter a CTE pathway in 10th grade. They would take courses during their 10th grade year. They would then, in the next year, be an 11th grader and continue their CTE courses, and then in 12th grade, they would complete the third and final year of this pathway. And as I just mentioned, the most recent report, the one I'll be talking about, we're now talking about people that were first-time ninth graders in the district in 2011-2012, which would make their on-time graduation year 2014-2015. So this particular report, compared to prior reports, because of changes in the way data was recorded, we now were, for the first time, able to identify students that began their, we were able to identify students that were taking CTE in 10th grade. Prior to that, we only were able to access data about students enrolled in 11th and 12th grades. And what that meant is that for the first time, we could identify a very particular group of students. So these would be students that commence CTE in 10th grade and then leave CTE. So prior to having the data in this way, they would be invisible to us. We would check in 11th grade, they would show up as non CTE students, and we were not able to distinguish them from students that had never taken CTE. So we're going to call this group the CTE drop Y1. So they drop CTE after 1 year. We analyzed this group very closely because they provided an opportunity to answer some questions that sort of lingered over a couple of these reports. So just to be absolutely clear who we're talking about all of the students who are first-time ninth graders in 2011-2012 in the district, excluding charter schools and excluding some of the alternative education sites within the district. You would be counted or tagged as a CTE student if you met one of these two requirements. If you, at some point in your high school career, took a CTE course, you're going to count as a CTE student regardless of whether you complete CTE or not. Or alternatively, if your last school record is one of 5 CTE only schools. In the district, there are 5 high schools that are strictly CTE. They have other characteristics. You have to apply to them. They're citywide admission. And the first criterion captures most of our CTE students. But there are a handful of students, for example, that are enrolled in one of those all CTE schools as ninth graders. They don't get to the point where they actually take a course, and then they leave the district, and we attribute them, their last attribution is to a CTE school. So there are a handful of students that get in that way. If you don't meet one of these two criteria, you're identified as a non-CTE student. So here is more information than you need. Just want to draw your attention to the very top line, the CTE on track. So these would be the students that fit that kind of idealized model. They take their courses in 10th, they continue in 11th, they continue in 12th. Of the students that have a CTE tag, only about half of them actually realize this 3-year uninterrupted sort of pathway. Down a couple of lines, you have the CTE drop Y1s. That's the people I'll be talking about today. So these are students that in their 10th grade year were enrolled in CTE, but did not continue CTE, didn't come back to it later. They took that CTE course for 1 year and then no more CTE. All right, so are CTE students different, are the students that opt into this, because this is one of the things we need to ask, if we're going to find differences between CTE students and non-CTE students, is it something about the profile of the kind of student that opts into this pathway? So compared to their peers, they are more likely to be Black or Hispanic, less likely to be white or Asian. They're more likely to be male. They're more likely to be free from tape, which is a economically disadvantaged proxy, severely economically disadvantaged, you can think of it that way. They're more likely to be, have English as a second language. All right, so that's demographics. Academically and behaviorally, the CTE students perform not quite as well on 8th grade PSSA, so immediately before high school. It's not a large gap, but they are have slightly lower scores on average. In terms of average daily attendance, overall the CTE students are very similar to their non-CTE peers. Taken together, it's just important to say, well, okay, given this slightly lower test scores in 8th grade, no real differences in attendance, there's no sort of argument that CTE is attracting the most prepared students. So going forward, when we talk about CTE students ending up with higher graduation rates, it's not really attributable to attracting students that are sort of inherently more likely to succeed. All right, so now focusing in on these students that take CTE in 10th grade and then drop out, that subgroup of CTE students do have prior history of lower attendance. So I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. We talked about graduation rates, and because graduation rates can be calculated differently at different times, so just a disclaimer, a non-drop departure is a student that's in the district and they depart the district for some other district. So they neither graduate nor drop out from Philadelphia. They get sort of excluded from our calculations. Students that transferred into the district after 9th grade are excluded from this analysis because this is about comparing a cohort of 9th graders that have the same sorts of opportunities to either opt into CTE or not. The district in calculating graduation rates has to account for these sorts of students, but because of the purposes of this analysis, they're not included here, which means if you see small differences between the graduation rates I'm going to be displaying in publicly available information, that's why. There are going to be some small differences. All right, so the cohort overall, non-CTE and CTE students, the highest bar is the probability of graduating, and this includes non-drop departures. This is the more standard kind of analysis, excluding the non-drop departures and just thinking of graduation rate. So the non-CTE students, that cohort graduated at a 66.6% rate, whereas the CTE students came in at 72.2%. All right, that's a substantial difference. Now, in the previous report, the CTE students came in at 84%. So an initial reaction to this to someone that was following reports year over year might be to look at that 72% and become alarmed and wonder what was going wrong, that suddenly it had dropped to 72%. But it's simply because now we were able to identify those students that took CTE in 10th grade and then departed CTE. So essentially the CTE metric is now based on a very different group of students, which if we pull those students out for a moment and say, well, what if we didn't have the ability to identify them in 10th grade, then we would have gotten 82%, very similar to the previous year's 84%. So what I am saying is there's no actual reason to think that the graduation rate of CTE students changed. We just now have a more comprehensive student of the full range, or a more comprehensive picture of the full range of CTE students. All right, so this group that drops CTE after 1 year, they have poorer outcomes than those that continue. They have poorer outcomes with the district as a whole. Because, following the chain of logic, in the past we've seen that students persisting in CTE tend to graduate better. It stands to reason that these students that we have them in CTE and then they depart CTE, that represents a step backwards in terms of their chances of graduating. So being able to identify those students before they drop out of CTE, perhaps be able to support them to continue CTE, might be very valuable. So we set about trying to figure out how to identify them before they drop out. Demographics didn't help much. The students in CTE that dropped after 1 year versus the ones that persisted are very similar in almost every measure. The only spot where they are different is they are more likely to be economically disadvantaged. But ethnicity doesn't seem to matter. Suspension history is not a good indicator of whether they will drop after 1 year. Being male versus female, disability, none of these other factors that sometimes play into this kind of analysis emerged as being important. What did matter were some academic and behavioral metrics, specifically attendance. And attendance is a continuous thing, but in a number of analyses, this 85% is sort of a high leverage point in identifying students that are much more likely to drop CTE. And then academically, if they had very poor grades in both English and math. Now, having poor grades in one is often enough, but if you have that, that double whammy, then those students are very highly likely to drop CTE after 1 year. Okay, that also sounds like the profile of someone who's going to have difficulty succeeding whether they're in CTE or not. And having said that, so we compared CTE students to non-CTE students. 9.2% of the CTE students have these risk factors, have both of them. About a little over 10% of the non-CTE students have this risk factor. Those are not terribly different kinds of base rates. Having said that, if you look at the bottom row and you look at graduation rates, high-risk students have both an ADA below 85% and D's or F's in English and math. Those that were in CTE, even though they're about to drop CTE in most cases, end up with a graduation rate of 27%, which is not high, but it is higher than the roughly 21% that the students with the same risk factors but who are not in CTE exhibit. Interestingly, for the students that are not high risk, CTE and non-CTE have very similar graduation rates. So what we're seeing here is that the advantage or the protective factor that CTE is conveying or conferring seems to be most focused on those students with the greatest challenges. That's where the bump is. So I say many of these high-risk students drop CTE, yes, but not all of them do. And if they don't, then their graduation rates climb very rapidly. So that first data point, 147 students were enrolled in CTE in 10th grade and then were enrolled in CTE and had these risk factors. If you took a snapshot in 2012, 2013, those students had about a 29% chance of graduating. Fast forward 1 year and ask the question, students that had those risk factors coming out of 9th grade, if they're still in CTE now, what is their graduation rate? And it's up to 50%. And if they are still there a year later, it's up to 84%. In comparison, same risk factors, but not enrolled in CTE year by year, 21%, 23%, 26%. In other words, persistence in CTE clearly year by year has a very powerful association with successful graduation. Students that in that yellow line, they're persisting in school. They're still in school, but they're not really making progress in terms of their probability of graduating. So in conclusion, CTE students are more likely to graduate than non-CTE students, all things being equal. And that is particularly true for students with the most serious academic and attendance challenges. And further, it's not really realistically attributable to prior kinds of attributes that we would normally associate with academic success.